The morning of November 17, 1923, Sheriff William Hartley stood at the threshold of what had once been the chapel of Hollow Creek Monastery, his breakfast threatening to revisit him as the stench of decay and something far worse. Something sweet and cloying like rotted flowers mixed with copper assaulted his senses. Behind him, Deputy Marcus Green had already succumbed, retching violently into the frost-covered grass. What they had discovered in the monastery's sealed crypts would not only rewrite the history of Pembroke County, Vermont, but would reveal a pattern of disappearances spanning 73 years, involving 41 confirmed victims, though the true number, as documented in Brother Augustine's meticulous journals, was likely closer to 117. The scene that greeted them in that underground chamber defied comprehension. 13 mummified corpses sat arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a crude stone altar, their bodies dressed in the black habits of Benedictine monks, their faces frozen in expressions of profound terror. But it was what lay beneath the altar, revealed when Deputy Green accidentally dislodged a loose stone, that would haunt both men until their dying days. Row upon row of small skulls, each no larger than a child's fist, arranged with mathematical precision in carved alcoves that extended deeper into the earth than their oil lamps could illuminate. The county coroner would later confirm what Sheriff Hartley already suspected. These were the remains of infants, some showing signs of ritual markings that suggested purposes too terrible to contemplate. Yet perhaps the most disturbing discovery was not the bodies themselves, but the leather-bound ledger found clutched in the skeletal hands of what they would later identify as Father Benedict Carlisle, the monastery's last abbot. Written in Latin, Gothic script, and occasionally a cipher that would take cryptographers 3 years to fully decode, the ledger contained detailed records of what its author called the Great Work, a systematic program of acquisition, indoctrination, and ultimately, transformation that had operated under the guise of Christian charity for the better part of a century. According to the Pembroke County Archives, document 1923 HC 41, Sheriff Hartley's official report stated simply, "Found evidence of unlawful deaths at abandoned monastery. Investigation ongoing." But his personal journal, donated to the Vermont Historical Society after his death in 1951, painted a far more disturbing picture. "There are things," he wrote, "that civilization agrees to forget, horrors we bury not in earth but in silence. Hollow Creek Monastery is such a place, and God help us all, we were not the first to discover its secrets, merely the first who could not be silenced. Welcome back, seekers of forgotten truths, to another descent into the darkest chapters of American history that they don't teach in schools, the ones buried in courthouse basements, sealed in archives, and whispered about only by those brave enough to remember. This is Malevolent Memoirs, where we excavate the horrors that time has tried desperately to forget. Before we continue our journey into the nightmare that was Hollow Creek Monastery, I need you to do something crucial. Hit that subscribe button right now, not tomorrow, not after the video, but right now. Click the notification bell and select all notifications, because you don't want to miss a single revelation we uncover. These stories, these truths, have a way of disappearing, of being scrubbed from the internet, and only our community of truth seekers keeps them alive. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, city and state, because I want to know how far these suppressed histories are reaching. Are you in Vermont, perhaps near where Hollow Creek once stood? Are you in one of the 43 states where similar monasteries operated during the same period? Your location might be more connected to this story than you realize. And remember, only the bravest souls, those who can stomach the unvarnished truth about humanity's capacity for evil disguised as good, should continue watching. What you're about to learn isn't just disturbing, it's a fundamental challenge to how we understand religious institutions, child welfare, and the very nature of trust in isolated communities. The rabbit hole we're about to descend into goes deeper than you can imagine. So buckle up, dear viewers, because the Hollow Creek Monastery's century of silence is about to be shattered, and I promise you, you'll never look at abandoned religious buildings the same way again. The year was 1850, when Brother Augustine Carlisle first set foot in the verdant valley that would become home to Hollow Creek Monastery, though the locals of Pembroke County, Vermont, would not learn his true name until the journals were decoded 7 decades later. To understand the horror that would unfold over the next 73 years, we must first understand the world that allowed such darkness to flourish undetected. Pembroke County in the mid-19th century was, by all accounts, an unremarkable corner of New England. Population 4847, according to the 1850 census, The county consisted primarily of dairy farms, timber operations, and the small but prosperous town of Millbridge, which served as the county seat. The town boasted two churches, Congregational and Methodist, a schoolhouse that doubled as a town hall, Brennan's General Store, and the Pembroke County Bank, established in 1831 by the industrious Whitmore family. Life moved with the predictable rhythm of the seasons: spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, and the long, isolating winters that would prove so crucial to the monastery's dark purposes. The Hollow Creek Valley itself lay 7 miles north of Millbridge, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during the spring thaws and winter snows. The creek for which it was named ran clear and cold from the mountains, fed by springs that the native Abenaki people had considered sacred before their forced removal in the 1790s. Local legend, recorded in Sarah Millbridge's History of Pembroke County, 1889, claimed that Abenaki had warned the first white settlers that the valley was cursed, that it was a place where the earth itself was hungry. Such warnings were dismissed as primitive superstition by the rational Christian settlers. The property that would become the monastery had previously belonged to Josiah Hartwell, a reclusive farmer who had died without heirs in 1849. His 347 acres of mostly forested land, along with a substantial but deteriorating farmhouse and several outbuildings, were purchased at auction by the Brothers of Perpetual Contemplation, a Benedictine order that claimed to have recently arrived from Belgium, fleeing the political upheavals that were consuming Europe. The county records, meticulously maintained by town clerk Howard Jessup, show the purchase price as $1,200, a surprisingly large sum that was paid in gold coins, raising no suspicions in a community grateful for the economic injection. Brother Augustine, who presented himself as the group's spokesman and would later become Father Benedict Carlisle after his ordination, was described in contemporary accounts as a man of extraordinary charisma. Standing 6 feet 2 inches, tall for the era, with piercing blue eyes and prematurely silver hair that gave him an air of wisdom beyond his 32 years, he spoke with a slight accent that locals couldn't quite place, but assumed was Belgian. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, could quote scripture from memory, and possessed a physician's knowledge of herbs and healing that would prove invaluable during the cholera outbreak of 1851. The Millbridge Gazette, in its August 15, 1850 edition, welcomed the brothers with enthusiasm. "Our valley has been blessed by the arrival of these pious men who seek only solitude for contemplation and prayer. Already they have begun the work of transforming the old Hartwell place into a house of God, and we understand they plan to offer Christian education to the children of the poor, as well as sanctuary to widows and orphans. Truly, the Lord works in mysterious ways to bring such gentle souls to our humble county." The physical transformation of the property was remarkable and swift. Within 6 months, the brothers, initially numbering 13, had erected a modest but beautiful chapel in the Gothic Revival style, complete with stained glass windows imported from Boston. The farmhouse was expanded into living quarters, and new buildings appeared with surprising speed: a rectory, a school building, workshops, and most significantly, what they called the Sanctuary of Mercy, a 3-story structure that would house the orphans and indigent women who sought their protection. The monks integrated themselves seamlessly into county life. They attended town meetings, contributed generously to local causes, and their leader, now calling himself Father Benedict, became a respected voice in community affairs. When the Millbridge Congregational Church's roof collapsed under heavy snow in the winter of 1851, the monks provided both funds and labor for its repair. When cholera struck that summer, claiming 47 lives, the monastery opened its doors as a hospital, with Father Benedict and his brothers working tirelessly to tend the sick. Dr. Cornelius Wade, the county's only physician, wrote in a letter to his colleague in Boston dated September 3, 1851, "The brothers of Hollow Creek have proven themselves invaluable during this terrible pestilence. Father Benedict especially shows remarkable knowledge of medicine, utilizing techniques I have not seen but which prove remarkably effective. Several children given up for death have recovered under his care, and the grateful families have entrusted their continued education to the monastery. We are blessed indeed to have such learned and selfless men among us." It was during this cholera outbreak that the monastery began its practice of taking in orphans, a mission that would become central to both its public reputation and its hidden purposes. The first 3 children, Mary Patterson, age 7, Thomas Brennan, age 9, and infant Catherine Wells, barely 6 months old, were formally placed in the monastery's care in September 1851, their families having perished in the epidemic. The county paid a stipend of $2 per month per child for their upkeep, and Judge Thaddeus Whitmore praised the arrangement as both economical and morally sound, placing these unfortunate souls under the guidance of godly men. The monastery's daily routine appeared exemplary. The bells rang for prayers 6 times daily, beginning with matins at 4:30 a.m. Local children who attended the monastery school, which by 1852 had enrolled 31 students, reported a strict but fair regime of education that included Latin, mathematics, natural philosophy, and of course, extensive religious instruction. The brothers grew their own food, maintained a substantial library that Father Benedict claimed contained over 3,000 volumes, and produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts that they sold to supplement their income. Yet there were, even in those early years, subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. Margaret O'Brien, who worked as a laundress for the monastery from 1851 to 1853, later told her daughter about doors that were always locked, even to us servants, and crying in the night that Father Benedict said was the wind, though I knew the sound of children's tears. The monastery purchased unusual quantities of certain supplies, far more candles than seemed necessary, exotic herbs and chemicals from Boston that Dr. Wade found curious, and building materials that seemed to disappear without any visible construction. Most tellingly, the turnover of children at the monastery was explained by an innovative placement program that Father Benedict had instituted. Orphans, he claimed, were being sent to carefully vetted Christian families throughout New England and even as far as Ohio and Illinois. The monastery kept detailed records of these placements, complete with letters from grateful adoptive families that were occasionally read aloud at town meetings. It would take investigators 70 years to discover that most of these families never existed, and the few that did had never received any children from Hollow Creek. The genius of Father Benedict's deception lay not in its complexity, but in its exploitation of the very virtues that 19th-century New England society held most dear: Christian charity, respect for religious authority, and the unquestioned sanctity of childhood innocence. The system he constructed over 2 decades was so thoroughly interwoven with the fabric of Pembroke County life that even those who harbored suspicions found themselves doubting their own judgment rather than questioning the monastery. Central to the deception was the creation of what Father Benedict called the Circle of Benediction, a group of prominent county citizens who served as the monastery's advisory board. Judge Thaddeus Whitmore served as chairman, with members including Bank President Edgar Whitmore, the judge's nephew, Dr. Cornelius Wade, Merchant Samuel Brennan, and remarkably, Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, the widow of former state Senator James Prescott and the county's most influential social reformer. These 5 individuals, all beyond reproach in the community, became unwitting accomplices to the monastery's crimes simply by lending their names and reputations to its operations. The circle met quarterly at the monastery, where they were treated to elaborate dinners, shown carefully orchestrated displays of the children's progress, and presented with detailed financial records that Mrs. Prescott would later describe as models of transparency and fiscal responsibility. The children who performed at these meetings, reciting Latin verses, demonstrating mathematical prowess, or singing hymns in perfectly trained voices, were always the same carefully selected group of 7 or 8, coached for weeks in advance and rewarded with extra food and privileges for their performances. Young Timothy Morrison, one of these display children who survived to testify decades later, recalled, "Father Benedict would drill us for hours before the trustees arrived. We had to smile just so, answer questions with specific phrases, and never, ever mention the children in the lower dormitories. He told us we were special, chosen, and that the other children weren't ready to be seen by important visitors. We believed we were protecting them." The monastery's correspondence system was particularly ingenious. Brother Francis, whose real name was discovered to be Francois Beaumont, a failed seminarian from Montreal with a talent for forgery, maintained 3 separate sets of records. The first, shown to the Circle of Benediction and county officials, detailed the placement of orphans with families throughout New England. The second, written in Latin and kept in Father Benedict's private study, contained the actual fate of each child. The third, encoded in a cipher based on medieval musical notation, documented what Father Benedict called the spiritual transformation metrics, a euphemistic term for experiments that defied both medical ethics and human decency. Brother Francis created an entire fictional network of correspondence. He wrote letters from non-existent adoptive families, crafted responses from imaginary parish priests confirming the children's well-being, and even fabricated occasional tragedies, children who had died of scarlet fever or consumption in their new homes, to explain why certain children could never be visited. The monastery maintained a post office box in Boston, managed by a Confederate known only as Mr. Gray, who would forward these fabricated letters back to Hollow Creek with appropriate postmarks. The few legitimate concerns that arose were handled with remarkable sophistication. When Mrs. Martha Henderson insisted on visiting her nephew William, who had been placed with the monastery after his parents died in a mill accident, she was told he had been adopted by a family in Providence. Father Benedict personally escorted her to Rhode Island, where she met a boy who looked remarkably like William, called her Aunt Martha, and seemed happy in his new home. It was only years later that investigators discovered this was an elaborate charade involving a child actor from a Boston theatrical company and a rented house furnished for the single afternoon of her visit. The monastery's medical activities provided another layer of concealment. Dr. Wade, despite his intelligence and dedication, was completely taken in by Father Benedict's apparent medical knowledge. The monk introduced several European treatments that seemed to produce remarkable results, particularly in cases of childhood illness. Parents whose children recovered under Father Benedict's care became fierce defenders of the monastery, unable to believe that their benefactor could harbor dark intentions. What Dr. Wade didn't know was that many of these miraculous recoveries were staged. Children from the monastery would be secretly made ill with carefully administered doses of various substances, ipecac to induce vomiting, small amounts of mercury to create fever, or herbal preparations that mimicked serious diseases. They would then be cured by Father Benedict's interventions, creating a reputation that brought more desperate families to the monastery's doors. The truly sick children who didn't respond to legitimate treatment simply disappeared into the placement program, their deaths explained as occurring after they left Hollow Creek. The monastery's physical layout was designed to facilitate deception. Visitors entered through the main gate and were restricted to what Brother Augustine's journals called the presentation zone, the chapel, the main school building, the front parlor of the Sanctuary of Mercy, and the carefully manicured gardens. The dormitories where visitors saw children were actually temporary quarters. The real living spaces were in the building's rear sections and underground chambers, accessible only through concealed entrances. Local tradesman Joseph Wheeler, who delivered supplies weekly for 15 years, later testified, "I must have been to that monastery 500 times, but I always went to the same receiving door, always dealt with Brother Thomas, and never once was invited inside. They paid promptly, ordered regularly, and Brother Thomas always had a kind word and often a small gift, preserved fruits or fresh bread, for my troubles. Why would I question such good customers?" The monastery also cultivated strategic relationships with local law enforcement. Sheriff Robert Daines, who served from 1855 to 1871, received generous donations for his re-election campaigns and was frequently invited to dine with Father Benedict. His deputy, Malcolm Stewart, had his son's education at the monastery school fully funded after the boy showed exceptional promise. When occasional rumors surfaced, a farmhand claiming to have heard screaming from the monastery at night, or a traveling merchant reporting strange lights in the windows, Sheriff Daines would dutifully investigate, always finding rational explanations provided by Father Benedict. Perhaps most disturbing was the monastery's recruitment method for new brothers. The original 13 had all been carefully selected by Father Benedict from various sources: defrocked priests with nowhere else to turn, medical students expelled for unethical experiments, and men whose particular proclivities made them unemployable in normal society. Each was bound to the monastery not just by oath, but by mutual blackmail, each knowing that exposure of the monastery's secrets would mean their own destruction. The first crack in Hollow Creek Monastery's carefully constructed facade appeared on April 12, 1867, though it would take decades for anyone to recognize its significance. Sarah Whitfield, age 15, a ward of the monastery for 7 years, was discovered by farmer Ezekiel Morris wandering in his fields at dawn, 3 miles from Hollow Creek. She was barefoot, wearing only a thin nightgown despite the freezing temperature, and appeared to be in a state of profound shock. According to the Pembroke County medical records, case file 1867-44, Dr. Wade's examination noted, "The patient exhibits signs of extreme distress, malnutrition despite the monastery's reputation for adequate feeding, and curious scarring on the inner arms suggesting repeated bloodletting. When questioned about her injuries, the patient becomes hysterical, speaking in Latin phrases interspersed with biblical quotations. Most disturbing are her repeated references to the chamber below and the 13 who watch. Father Benedict arrived at Dr. Wade's office within 2 hours of Sarah's discovery, expressing profound concern and sorrow. He explained that Sarah had been suffering from religious mania for several months, a condition he attributed to her traumatic memories of losing her entire family in a fire. The scarring, he claimed, was self-inflicted during episodes of hysteria where she believed she needed to purify her blood for Christ. He produced detailed medical notes in his own hand, documenting Sarah's supposed decline and the monastery's attempts to treat her with prayer and gentle restraint. We had hoped to avoid sending her to the state lunatic asylum, Father Benedict told Dr. Wade, his voice heavy with regret. But perhaps professional alienists could help where our humble prayers have failed. Within a week, Sarah Whitfield was committed to the Brattleboro Retreat for the Insane, where records show she died 6 months later of acute melancholia with refusing of sustenance. Her final words, recorded by attendant nurse Catherine Holbrook, were, "The babies, they put them on the walls. Can you not hear them crying?" The second incident occurred on September 23, 1871, and involved the Brennan twins, Michael and Margaret, age 11. The children had been residents of the monastery since 1868, when their widowed mother died of consumption. Their uncle, Patrick Brennan of Boston, had arrived unexpectedly to collect them, having finally achieved financial stability after years of poverty. What he discovered would launch the first serious investigation into Hollow Creek, though it would ultimately be suppressed. According to Patrick Brennan's sworn affidavit, filed with the Massachusetts State Police but mysteriously disappeared from their archives until 1923, he found his nephew Michael working in what the monks called the Redemption Garden, a walled section behind the main monastery buildings. The boy didn't recognize him at first and seemed terrified when Patrick identified himself. Margaret was nowhere to be found. Father Benedict explained she had been placed with a family in Connecticut 2 months prior. Patrick Brennan wrote, "My nephew bore marks of regular beatings, though Brother Augustine insisted they were from penitential self-flagellation that the boy had voluntarily undertaken. When I demanded to see my niece, they produced letters from her supposed adoptive family, but I recognized neither the handwriting as hers nor the phrases as something Margaret would say. When I insisted on taking Michael immediately, Father Benedict suddenly remembered that both children had been legally bound to the monastery's custody by the county court. Judge Thaddeus Whitmore confirmed that such papers existed, signed by the children's dying mother and witnessed by 2 respectable citizens. Patrick Brennan spent 3 months fighting the custody arrangement, during which time he was twice arrested for attempting to forcibly remove a ward of the court, and once for public intoxication, though he swore he had never touched liquor since taking the temperance pledge in 1865. Eventually, faced with mounting legal costs and threats of imprisonment, he returned to Boston. Michael Brennan's name appears in monastery records until 1872, after which he was reportedly placed with a Christian family in Ohio. No further trace of him or his sister has ever been found. The third and most dramatic incident began on the night of December 13, 1874, when fire destroyed the monastery's east workshop. The fire, which started around midnight, brought most of Milbridge's able-bodied men to help fight the flames. Among them was Thomas Hartley, a young schoolteacher and son of prominent merchant Joshua Hartley, who would later father Sheriff William Hartley, the man who would finally expose Hollow Creek's secrets. Thomas Hartley's journal, preserved in the Hartley family papers, describes what he witnessed. While helping to evacuate the buildings, I became separated from the main group and found myself in a part of the monastery I had never seen. Through smoke and confusion, I discovered a door that had been broken open by the heat, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Thinking someone might be trapped below, I descended and found myself in a vast underground chamber filled with what appeared to be medical equipment, tables with restraints, shelves of specimens in jars, and most disturbingly, what looked like a surgical theater with seating arranged around a central table, stained with what could only be blood. Before he could investigate further, Brother Francis found him and urgently directed him outside, explaining that he had discovered the monastery's anatomical study room, where the brothers conducted necessary medical research to better serve the community. Father Benedict later personally visited Thomas Hartley to explain that the underground chamber was used for preparing bodies for burial, a sacred duty the monastery performed for indigent families. He showed Hartley official documentation from the county, permitting such activities and testimonials from families grateful for the monastery's discreet and dignified handling of their departed loved ones. Yet Thomas Hartley remained troubled. He noted in his journal, Father Benedict's explanation was perfectly reasonable, even noble. But why then did I see what appeared to be fresh blood? Why were there restraints on tables meant for the already dead? And why, in one corner, barely visible in my lamp's light, did I glimpse what seemed to be children's clothing, neatly folded and numbered, as if waiting for owners who would never return? Hartley began his own quiet investigation, spending months researching the monastery's placement records and trying to verify the existence of families who had supposedly adopted Hollow Creek children. He wrote to parishes, checked civil records, and even hired a private investigator in Boston. Of the 43 adoptive families he attempted to locate from the past 5 years, he found evidence of only 12, and of those, only 3 had actually received children from the monastery, all 3 being prominent families whose adopted children were regularly displayed at public events. On February 3, 1875, Thomas Hartley arranged to meet with State Attorney Samuel Morrison in Montpelier to present his findings. He never arrived. His body was discovered 2 days later at the bottom of Hollow Creek Gorge, his horse nearby with a broken leg. The death was ruled accidental, a tragic result of attempting to travel during a winter storm. His research papers were never found, though Father Benedict personally delivered a box of personal effects to the grieving Hartley family, expressing his deep sorrow at the loss of such a promising young man who had shown such interest in the monastery's charitable works. The fourth incident, in May 1878, involved a group of 5 children who had supposedly been placed with families in New Hampshire. Mrs. Dorothy Pembridge, a widow who had volunteered at the monastery for 3 years teaching needlework to the girls, had grown particularly attached to one child, Emma Carlson, age 9. When told of Emma's placement with a family in Manchester, Mrs. Pembridge decided to visit, wanting to ensure her favorite pupil was well settled. What she discovered in Manchester was that no family named Harrison, the supposed adoptive parents, had ever lived at the address provided. The local parish priest, Father O'Malley, had never heard of them nor received any child from Hollow Creek Monastery. When Mrs. Pembridge returned to confront Father Benedict, she found him prepared with letters, receipts, and even a daguerreotype supposedly showing Emma with her new family. He gently suggested that Mrs. Pembridge had perhaps gone to the wrong address, that Manchester was a large city, and that her advancing age might have caused some confusion. But Dorothy Pembridge was neither senile nor easily deterred. She hired a lawyer, Mr. James Crawford of Montpelier, to investigate not just Emma's placement but all of the monastery's adoptions from the previous year. Crawford's investigation lasted exactly 3 weeks before he suddenly withdrew from the case, citing personal matters requiring immediate attention. He left Vermont permanently, and Mrs. Pembridge found no other lawyer willing to take her case. She continued to speak out about her suspicions until her death in 1880 from what Dr. Wade diagnosed as a sudden stroke, though her housemaid swore Mrs. Pembridge had been in perfect health that morning. Dear viewers, if you've made it this far, you're witnessing the systematic unraveling of one of America's darkest cover-ups. But I need to warn you, what comes next transcends mere crime. What Sheriff Hartley discovered in 1923 wasn't just evidence of murder. It was proof of something so methodically evil that 3 of the investigators required psychiatric treatment after viewing the full evidence. Right now, before we descend into the true abyss of Hollow Creek, share this video with someone you trust, someone who needs to know that history's greatest horrors often hide behind the most benevolent faces. Comment below if you've ever driven past an abandoned religious building and felt that inexplicable chill, that primal warning that some places should remain forgotten. And ask yourself this: how many times have we dismissed the testimony of children, the concerns of women, the suspicions of those we deem hysterical or confused? The Hollow Creek tragedy persisted for 7 decades not because evidence didn't exist, but because society chose to believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. What you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you view institutional power, child welfare systems, and the very nature of trust. The discovery section I'm about to share contains information that was sealed by court order until 1998, and even now, certain details remain classified by the Vermont State Archives. Still watching? Still want to know what horror can flourish when good people choose willful blindness? Then steel yourself, because we're about to enter that chapel on November 17, 1923, and witness what made hardened lawmen weep like children. The autumn of 1923 had been unusually warm in Vermont, which made the smell emanating from the abandoned Hollow Creek Monastery impossible to ignore. The monastery had been officially closed since Father Benedict's death in 1901, but local farmer Edwin Morse had noticed an increasingly putrid odor when the wind shifted north. On November 15th, his son Daniel, age 16, decided to investigate, believing perhaps a deer had died in one of the buildings. What Daniel Morse found sent him running 3 miles without stopping to the Millbridge police station. According to the official police record, case 1923 HC001, the boy was in such a state of hysteric terror that Dr. Benjamin Carter was required to administer a sedative before coherent testimony could be obtained. When finally able to speak, Daniel's statement was simple. "The monks, they're all still there, sitting in a circle, but their eyes are gone." Sheriff William Hartley, son of the same Thomas Hartley who had died investigating the monastery in 1875, assembled a team of 4 men: Deputy Marcus Green, Deputy Samuel Morrison, Dr. Benjamin Carter, and Father Michael O'Brien from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Millbridge. What they discovered on the morning of November 17th would take weeks to fully catalogue and years to comprehend. The monastery's main chapel, which had been sealed since 1901, required crow bars to open. The massive oak doors, swollen with decades of humidity, finally gave way with a sound that Deputy Morrison later described as like the building itself was screaming. The smell that rushed out caused all 5 men to stagger backward. It wasn't merely decay. It was decay mixed with incense, formaldehyde, and something else. Something sweet and chemical that Dr. Carter would later identify as a primitive embalming fluid made from honey, mercury, and arsenic. The chapel's interior was lit by 13 candles that had impossibly continued burning for over 2 decades, though investigation would reveal an ingenious system of oil reserves and wicks that Father Benedict had designed to feed the flames indefinitely. In the flickering light, they saw the 13 monks arranged in perfect meditation poses around a central stone altar. Their bodies had been partially mummified by the chemical atmosphere, but their eye sockets were indeed empty, filled instead with polished obsidian stones that reflected the candlelight like black mirrors. Father O'Brien immediately began Latin prayers, but stopped abruptly when he realized the walls were covered in text, not biblical passages, but what appeared to be detailed confessions written in various hands. Sheriff Hartley would spend 3 days photographing these walls, capturing over 400 pages of admissions that detailed crimes spanning from 1851 to 1901. The handwriting analysis would confirm 13 different authors, each monk having apparently documented their participation in what they called the great work of transformation. But it was Dr. Carter's medical examination that revealed the true horror. Each monk showed signs of ritual self-mutilation performed while still alive, precise surgical scars indicating the removal of specific organs, all except the heart and brain. These organs, they would soon discover, were preserved in jars in the chamber below the altar. More disturbing still, the positioning of the bodies and the stage of rigor mortis suggested that all 13 monks had died simultaneously, possibly through synchronized poison ingestion, on August 13, 1901, exactly 50 years after the monastery's founding. The altar itself was a masterwork of horror disguised as religious art. What appeared to be decorative carvings were actually anatomical diagrams showing surgical procedures. The Latin inscriptions, when translated by Professor Harrison Blackwood of Harvard, weren't prayers but detailed instructions for what Father Benedict called the preservation of innocence through transformation, a process that began to make terrible sense when they discovered what lay beneath. Deputy Green's accidental discovery of the loose stone was fortuitous, as the hidden mechanism would have been nearly impossible to find otherwise. The stone, when removed, revealed a lever that opened a section of floor near the altar. The chamber below was accessed by stone stairs that descended 30 feet into the earth. The walls were lined with carved alcoves, each containing carefully arranged human remains. The smaller skulls, those of infants and young children, were positioned in the upper rows with larger skulls below, creating a grotesque gallery of death. Dr. Carter's preliminary count identified 217 individual skulls, though many showed signs of surgical intervention. Holes drilled with precision that suggested trepanation, jaw bones removed and modified, and most disturbingly, many child skulls showing evidence of repeated procedures over time, indicating the victims had been kept alive through multiple operations. The chamber extended into 3 additional rooms. The first contained what could only be described as a surgical theater, with a metal table, unusual for the period, surrounded by shelves of preserved organs in jars of formaldehyde. Each jar was meticulously labeled with names, dates, and notations in Father Benedict's hand describing the spiritual essence extracted. A ledger found on one shelf contained detailed records of procedures performed on 341 individuals between 1851 and 1901, though only 217 sets of remains were found, suggesting some bodies had been disposed of elsewhere. The second room contained personal effects, children's clothing, toys, books, and heartbreakingly, letters written by children to families they would never see again. These letters, never sent, painted a picture of systematic psychological manipulation. Children wrote of being chosen for special purposes, of ascending to higher forms, and of joining the eternal circle. The progression of handwriting in multiple letters from the same children showed their gradual indoctrination and eventually their resignation to their fate. The third room defied immediate understanding. It contained 13 wooden chairs arranged in a circle around a central pedestal. On the pedestal sat a leather-bound volume that would become known as the Codex of Transformation, Father Benedict's master work detailing his philosophy and methods. Written in multiple languages and ciphers, it would take cryptographers and theologians 3 years to fully decode, and when they did, several refused to continue their work, citing knowledge that shouldn't exist in a sane world. Sheriff Hartley's journal entry for that day reads, "We found children's drawings on one wall, pictures of angels and demons, of figures being cut open, and things being removed or added. One child had drawn themselves with wings, but the wings were made of what looked like surgical stitches. Below it, in a child's hand, were the words, 'Soon I will fly to heaven like Father Benedict promised. God forgive us all for not listening to the warnings.' The evidence also included financial records, showing that the monastery had received payments from wealthy families across New England, not for adoptions, as claimed, but for spiritual transformation services. These families, believing they were funding revolutionary medical treatments for their diseased or disabled children, had unknowingly financed Father Benedict's experiments. Letters from grateful parents thanking the monastery for curing their children took on new, horrific meaning when cross-referenced with the surgical records. The initial discovery at Hollow Creek Monastery triggered the largest criminal investigation in Vermont's history, though its full scope would remain hidden from the public for decades. State Attorney General Franklin Pierce, no relation to the former president, personally took charge, assembling a team that included federal investigators, Harvard Medical School pathologists, and remarkably, 2 theologians from the Vatican who arrived unannounced on December 3, 1923, claiming ecclesiastical authority to examine the evidence. The breakthrough in understanding the monastery's true network came from an unexpected source. Elijah Whitmore, age 43, grandson of Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, who appeared at the sheriff's office on November 29th with a locked strongbox he had discovered hidden in his grandfather's estate papers. Inside were correspondence between Judge Whitmore and Father Benedict dating from 1858 to 1889, revealing not the judge's complicity, but his growing horror at discoveries he had made while serving as the monastery's legal advocate. Judge Whitmore had written in 1887, "I fear I have been an unwitting guardian to something unconscionable. The placement records you showed me were forgeries. I have confirmed this through discreet inquiries. Yet when I confronted you, Father, you showed me things that challenged my very understanding of life and death. You claim these children transcend mortality through your procedures, but what I witnessed in that underground chamber was not transcendence but abomination. I am too old and too compromised to act, but I leave this record so that justice might eventually prevail." The judge had been blackmailed into silence. Father Benedict possessed documents proving that Whitmore had embezzled county funds in his youth, a crime that would destroy not just the judge but his entire family's reputation. This pattern of blackmail, investigators discovered, extended throughout the monastery's network of supporters. Bank President Edgar Whitmore had falsified loans, Dr. Cornelius Wade had performed illegal abortions, and merchant Samuel Brennan had been involved in smuggling operations during the Civil War. Each man's secret had been carefully documented by Father Benedict, creating a web of mutual assured destruction that protected the monastery for decades. The investigation team located 3 living survivors who had been residents of Hollow Creek. Their testimonies, taken separately and compared for consistency, painted a picture of systematic horror that transcended simple murder. Martha Blackwood, formerly Martha Henderson, age 47, had lived at the monastery from 1882 to 1889. Her testimony, recorded over 7 sessions due to her frequent emotional breakdowns, revealed the process of selection. Father Benedict would observe us for months, recording everything in his notebooks, our temperaments, our intelligence, our physical characteristics. He said he was determining our spiritual potential. The chosen ones were taken to what he called the sanctum of ascension. They never returned to the regular dormitories. We were told they had been adopted, but sometimes, late at night, we could hear them screaming from somewhere below the chapel. She continued, those of us not chosen for ascension served other purposes. The girls were taught to be perfect servants, nurses, or teachers, but always with complete loyalty to Father Benedict. Several girls simply disappeared when they reached a certain age. We were told they had been placed in service with wealthy families, but I later learned from Brother Augustine's journals that they had been sold to brothels in Boston and New York, with the proceeds funding the monastery's operations. Robert Morrison, no relation to the state attorney, age 38, had been at Hollow Creek from 1891 to 1896. His account focused on the medical experiments. Father Benedict believed he could isolate the human soul through surgical intervention. He had studied medieval texts, Eastern mysticism, and what he called ancient Egyptian preservation sciences. The younger children, especially infants, were preferred because he believed their souls were less attached to the flesh. He would perform surgeries while they were alive but sedated with a mixture of opium and other substances. He claimed he could see the soul leaving the body if the procedure was done correctly. Morrison's most disturbing revelation concerned the 13 monks themselves. They weren't all originally monks. Some were doctors who had lost their licenses, others were men who had fled Europe after unspecified crimes. Father Benedict recruited them with promises of unlimited freedom to pursue forbidden knowledge. Each had to participate in the procedures to prove their commitment. By the end, they had all become true believers in Father Benedict's vision of transcending death through the suffering of innocence. The third survivor, Clara Jennings, age 52, had been at the monastery only briefly in 1888, but had worked as a nurse at the Brattleboro retreat, where many former Hollow Creek residents were committed. She testified, they would arrive in states of complete mental collapse, speaking of impossible things, surgeries performed without anesthesia where they remained conscious but unable to move or scream, being forced to watch procedures on other children, and something they called the feeding, which none could describe without becoming hysterical. Of the 37 Hollow Creek residents committed to Brattleboro between 1867 and 1900, all died within a year of arrival, most by their own hand. The investigation revealed that Father Benedict's network extended far beyond Vermont. Correspondence found in the monastery's archives showed connections to similar institutions in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Louisiana. A letter dated March 15, 1876, from someone identified only as Brother Mauritius in New Orleans, discussed sharing preservation techniques and the successful transformation of 7 Negro children whose disappearance would raise no questions. Another letter from Pennsylvania mentioned the coal mine children who are presumed dead being perfect subjects for the great work. Financial records revealed the staggering scope of the operation. The monastery had accumulated over $400,000 through various means, selling children into servitude, blackmailing prominent citizens, and receiving payments from wealthy families for medical treatments. But the money had been spent just as quickly on medical equipment, chemicals, books, and bribes to officials who might have investigated. A payment of $5,000 to State Inspector Clarence Booth in 1895 was noted as, for continued blindness to our necessary work. The sophisticated medical equipment found in the monastery was decades ahead of what most American hospitals possessed. Investigation revealed that Father Benedict had been corresponding with disgraced European doctors, including Dr. Wilhelm Steinberg, who had been expelled from the University of Vienna for experiments violating all bounds of medical ethics, and Dr. Francois Moreau, who had fled France after being accused of vivisection. These men had sent not just equipment, but detailed instructions for procedures that mainstream medicine wouldn't attempt for another 50 years, though Father Benedict's purposes were far from healing. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what Father Benedict called his gallery of preservation. Hidden behind a false wall in the 3rd underground chamber were 43 glass cases containing what appeared to be perfectly preserved children, aged between 2 and 7 years. Dr. Carter's examination revealed they had been subjected to an experimental embalming process while still alive, their blood replaced with Father Benedict's chemical mixture through a process that took days to complete. The children's expressions suggested they had been conscious until the very end. The investigation also uncovered the true identity of Father Benedict himself. He was not Augustine Carlyle from Belgium, but Dr. Augustus Blackstone, a brilliant surgeon who had graduated from Edinburgh Medical School in 1844. He had been expelled from the medical profession in London in 1848 after being caught performing unauthorized experiments on charity hospital patients. He had fled to America, reinvented himself as a monk, and used religious authority to continue his work. His real name appeared only once in all the monastery's documents, signed at the bottom of his final journal entry on August 13, 1901. I, Augustus Blackstone, go now to test my greatest theory upon myself. If you find this record, know that I have either transcended death or proven it absolute. Either way, my work is complete. The Vatican representatives, Fathers Giovanni Romano and Luis Mendoza, revealed that the Catholic Church had been investigating reports of heretical practices at Hollow Creek since 1872, but had been repeatedly assured by American bishops that the monastery was operating within acceptable bounds. They took possession of several documents that they claimed were blasphemous texts that should never have existed, including what appeared to be Father Benedict's attempts to create new religious ceremonies incorporating his surgical procedures. These documents were sealed in the Vatican secret archives, where they presumably remain to this day. While Father Benedict had orchestrated his own death in 1901, the investigation of 1923 revealed that not all of his accomplices had joined him in his final ritual. The confrontation that Sheriff William Hartley and State Attorney General Franklin Pierce most dreaded was not with the dead, but with the living, those who had known, who had participated, or who had chosen silence over salvation for hundreds of children. The first confrontation occurred on December 7, 1923, when investigators arrived at the Boston residence of Mr. Jonathan Gray, age 67, the mysterious postal intermediary who had managed the monastery's fraudulent correspondence for 30 years. Gray, who lived in a modest but comfortable brownstone on Beacon Hill, answered the door himself, dressed in an expensive silk robe. According to Detective Michael Sullivan's report, Gray's first words were, "I've been expecting you for 22 years. Would you care for tea while I explain my role in this abomination?" Gray's confession, recorded over 6 hours, was delivered with what Detective Sullivan described as the detached precision of a man discussing someone else's crimes. He revealed that he had been a failed seminarian who Father Benedict had recruited in 1868 after discovering Gray's embezzlement from his previous employer. "Father Benedict didn't threaten to expose me," Gray explained. "He showed me his work, his vision of transcending human limitations through suffering. He convinced me I was participating in something greater than conventional morality could comprehend. I managed correspondence, created false identities, and arranged for the disposal of children who were sold to various establishments. I told myself they were better off than what happened to those who remained at Hollow Creek." When asked how many children he had personally trafficked, Gray consulted a leather ledger he retrieved from a hidden safe. 213 over 30 years, he said without emotion. "I have names, dates, and destinations. Most went to factories or brothels. The fortunate ones died quickly." When Sheriff Hartley asked how he could live with such knowledge, Gray responded, "Sheriff, I stopped living in any meaningful sense the day I agreed to Father Benedict's proposition. I've been a ghost walking through my own existence, waiting for this moment of reckoning." The second major confrontation involved Dr. Cornelius Wade, now 81 and still practicing medicine in Millbridge. When presented with evidence of his complicity, specifically, medical records showing he had referred 37 children to the monastery knowing they would never emerge, the elderly doctor collapsed. After being revived, he provided a statement that revealed the depth of the monastery's psychological control. "Father Benedict knew about the abortions I had performed," Dr. Wade admitted, "but it was more than blackmail. He showed me things, medical procedures that shouldn't have been possible with our understanding of anatomy. He removed a tumor from my wife's brain in 1869, a surgery that saved her life when I had given her up for dead. He could transplant organs between bodies, keeping both donor and recipient alive. He promised to share this knowledge if I helped identify suitable subjects, orphans, the mentally deficient, those whose disappearance wouldn't be questioned. Dr. Wade's revelation about organ transplantation was confirmed by the medical equipment found in the monastery and the surgical records. Father Benedict had been performing procedures that wouldn't be successfully replicated in mainstream medicine until the 1950s, though his methods involved what Dr. Wade described as suffering beyond imagination for the donors, who were kept alive through multiple harvesting procedures. The most dramatic confrontation occurred on December 15th, when investigators attempted to arrest Brother Francois Beaumont, who had been living under the assumed name of Frederick Bowman in Montreal. The 71-year-old former forger had been working as a bookkeeper for a Catholic charity, ironically helping to place orphans with families. When Canadian mounted police arrived at his boarding house, they found him in his room, surrounded by hundreds of pages of confession he had been writing for years. "I cannot be arrested," Brother Francis told the officers, "for I am already dead. I died the day I created the first false letter from a happy adopted child. Everything since has been purgatory." His written confession revealed the full extent of the forgery network, including the creation of an entire fictional town in Illinois, Blessed Acres, complete with forged municipal documents, fake newspaper clippings, and fabricated census records, all to support the illusion that dozens of children had been placed there. Brother Francis also revealed the existence of 5 other monks who had fled before the mass suicide of 1901. 3 had died in the intervening years, but 2, Brother Marcus and Brother Jerome, were believed to be living under assumed names in California and Texas respectively. Neither was ever located, despite extensive searches. The investigation team's confrontation with the surviving members of the Circle of Benediction, the monastery's advisory board, revealed the complex psychology of communal denial. Edgar Whitmore, the elderly bank president, insisted even when presented with overwhelming evidence that Father Benedict had been a man of God doing difficult work. Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, now 89 and one of the county's most respected citizens, broke down completely when shown photographs from the underground chambers, repeating over and over, "We didn't know, we couldn't have known, he showed us happy children." But the most chilling confrontation came from an unexpected source. On December 20th, a package arrived at the sheriff's office with no return address, postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a journal and a letter signed Brother Thomas, formerly of Hollow Creek. The letter read, "I participated in Father Benedict's work from 1875 to 1901. I was present for 103 procedures. I held the children down while they screamed. I told them they were ascending to heaven while Father Benedict removed their organs. I cannot be captured because I am everywhere and nowhere. I walk among you in your cities, indistinguishable from any other elderly man. I have changed my name 7 times and lived in 13 states. You will never find me, but I want you to know this. Father Benedict was not unique. There are others like him, other institutions conducting similar work. We called ourselves the Brotherhood of Transcendence. Hollow Creek was just one node in a network that stretched across the continent. Some operate as orphanages, others as sanitariums, Indian schools, or homes for wayward girls. The work continues, refined and hidden better than Father Benedict ever managed. I am sending you this confession not from guilt, I feel none, but from professional pride. Father Benedict's work was brilliant but flawed. He believed suffering was the key to transcendence. The new generation has learned that compliance can be achieved through more subtle means. You have found one monastery, there are 43 more. You will never find them all. The journal contained detailed accounts of procedures, names of victims, and most disturbingly, improvements Brother Thomas had suggested for making the operations more efficient. It also contained a list of 17 locations across the United States where similar institutions might be operating, though subsequent investigations found only abandoned buildings or legitimate organizations with no apparent connections to Hollow Creek. The legal system's attempt to prosecute the surviving conspirators faced numerous challenges. Jonathan Gray was convicted of human trafficking and died in prison in 1925. Dr. Wade was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to an asylum where he died within 6 months. Brother Francis was extradited to Vermont but committed suicide in his cell before trial, using a poison he had concealed for over 2 decades, a final gift from Father Benedict, he claimed in his suicide note. The confrontation with the broader community of Milbridge and Pembroke County was perhaps the most complex. Town meetings erupted in shouting matches between those who demanded a full accounting and those who insisted on letting the dead bury the dead. Reverend Paul Morrison of the Milbridge Congregational Church delivered a sermon on December 23rd that captured the community's struggle. We stand confronted not just with the evil that was done, but with our collective failure to see it. Every one of us who praised the monastery's charity, who sent our children to their school, who accepted their medical care, we are all complicit. The question now is not how we failed to see, but why we chose not to look. The signs were there. The children who disappeared, the families who asked questions and were silenced, the good Christians who raised concerns and were dismissed as troublemakers. We chose comfort over truth, and hundreds of innocents paid the price. The revelations of Hollow Creek Monastery sent shockwaves through American society that extended far beyond Vermont's borders. The immediate aftermath saw Pembroke County thrust into a national spotlight it neither wanted nor could escape. By January 1924, reporters from newspapers across the country had descended upon Millbridge, turning the quiet town into what the Boston Globe called America's chamber of collective guilt. The legal proceedings that followed were hampered by jurisdiction disputes, the advanced age or death of most perpetrators, and the deliberate destruction of evidence that Father Benedict had orchestrated before his death. State Attorney General Franklin Pierce established a special tribunal that operated for 3 years, ultimately producing a 1847-page report that was immediately classified and wouldn't be fully released until 1998. Even then, 73 pages remained redacted, allegedly containing information about similar institutions that were still under investigation. The financial aftermath was staggering. The monastery's assets, including the $400,000 discovered in various accounts, were seized by the state. After lengthy legal battles, the money was used to establish the Hollow Creek Memorial Fund, which provided compensation to confirmed survivors and funded the creation of new child welfare oversight mechanisms. However, only 17 survivors could be definitively identified from the monastery's deliberately obscured records, and each received a mere $3,000, a sum that Judge Harold Patterson called an insult to their suffering but all that the law allows. The property itself became a source of intense debate. Initial plans to demolish the monastery were met with opposition from historians who argued it should be preserved as a memorial and warning. Others, including most survivors, wanted every trace erased. The compromise reached in 1925 was to seal the underground chambers with concrete, demolish all structures above ground, and erect a simple memorial listing the names of known victims. However, the memorial was vandalized so frequently, both by those who felt it said too much and those who felt it said too little, that it was removed in 1931. The Catholic Church's response was swift but controversial. Pope Pius XI issued a statement condemning the heretical and satanic practices at Hollow Creek, while maintaining that the monastery had operated outside church authority. American bishops implemented new oversight measures for religious institutions, but critics argued these reforms were cosmetic. Father Giovanni Romano, one of the Vatican investigators, privately told Sheriff Hartley that the church had known about Hollow Creek's irregularities since at least 1872, but had chosen not to intervene to avoid scandal. The medical community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the origins of certain anatomical knowledge. Dr. Harrison Blackstone of Johns Hopkins Medical School published a controversial paper in 1925 arguing that some of Father Benedict's surgical techniques, while obtained through unconscionable means, had advanced understanding of organ transplantation by decades. This sparked fierce debate about whether knowledge gained through atrocity could or should be used. The American Medical Association ultimately declared that any research derived from Hollow Creek should be condemned and discarded, though rumors persisted that certain procedures continued to be studied in secret. The impact on Pembroke County's communities was devastating and long-lasting. The 1930 census showed that Millbridge had lost 40% of its population, with many families unable to bear the weight of their community's dark history. The Whitmore family, despite no direct involvement in the crimes, saw their banking empire collapse as depositors lost faith. The building that had housed Dr. Wade's practice stood empty for 20 years, as no doctor would take over the space. Even the Millbridge Congregational Church saw its congregation dwindle to just 12 families by 1928. Children who had attended the monastery's school, even those never subjected to abuse, carried lifelong stigma. Mary Patterson Thompson, who had been a day student from 1888 to 1890, wrote in her memoir Shadows of Hollow Creek, published 1967, "We were marked, all of us. Other children were forbidden to play with us, Parents would cross the street to avoid us. We were contaminated by association, victims of proximity to evil. Many of us left Vermont entirely, changed our names, and never spoke of our education at Hollow Creek. The investigation's findings triggered widespread reform of child welfare systems across New England and eventually nationwide. The Federal Child Protection Act of 1927, known informally as the Hollow Creek Law, established mandatory inspection requirements for all institutions housing children, required multiple unrelated witnesses for adoption proceedings, and created federal penalties for child trafficking. Vermont went further, becoming the first state to require background investigations for anyone working with children in institutional settings. However, the reforms came with unintended consequences. The foster care system, already strained, nearly collapsed as families became reluctant to take in orphaned children, fearing accusations. Religious institutions faced such stringent oversight that many closed their charitable operations entirely. The Brattleboro Retreat reported that admissions of children dropped by 75% as families feared institutionalization of any kind, even when medically necessary. The psychological impact on the investigators was severe and lasting. Sheriff William Hartley never recovered from what he had seen. His wife, Margaret, later testified that he would wake screaming about the children in the walls and developed an obsession with checking on local orphanages at random hours. He resigned his position in 1925 and spent his remaining years writing and rewriting his account of the investigation, producing 17 different versions, each more detailed and horrifying than the last. He died by his own hand in 1951, leaving a note that said simply, "I can still hear them." Deputy Marcus Green left law enforcement entirely, becoming a traveling preacher who spoke about the devil walking among us in holy cloth. His sermons, transcribed by followers, reveal a man haunted by specific images. "I see those empty eye sockets every time I close my eyes. Those obsidian stones reflect our lamp light, reflecting our failure to protect the innocent. How many times did someone almost discover the truth? How many times did we choose not to see?" The discovery at Hollow Creek also triggered a wave of investigations into similar institutions across the country. Between 1924 and 1930, federal investigators examined 314 orphanages, religious schools, and sanitariums. While none matched the systematic horror of Hollow Creek, they found evidence of abuse, neglect, and suspicious disappearances at 67 facilities. The resulting prosecutions and reforms reshaped American child welfare, though many argued the investigations didn't go far enough. Brother Thomas's claim about a network of similar institutions was never fully substantiated, though troubling patterns emerged. The Ashford School for Wayward Girls in Pennsylvania, closed in 1926, was found to have underground chambers similar to Hollow Creek's, though they claimed these were merely storage areas. The St. Catherine's Home for Indigent Children in Louisiana burned down in 1925, the night before investigators were scheduled to arrive. The Indian Industrial School in Oklahoma, when investigated, had records showing 200 children transferred to other facilities, with no documentation of where they had gone. The international implications were equally disturbing. The investigation revealed that Father Benedict had corresponded with similar-minded individuals in 12 countries. A sanitarium in Bavaria, closed by German authorities in 1925, was found to have been conducting experiments nearly identical to those at Hollow Creek. An orphanage in Argentina, run by a defrocked priest named Father Miguel Santos, disappeared entirely, the building, the staff, and 43 children, in 1924, leaving only empty foundations and local legends about the night the earth swallowed the innocent. The academic study of Hollow Creek became its own field, with historians, psychologists, and theologians attempting to understand how such systematic evil could operate for so long. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman's seminal work, The Architecture of Deception, Hollow Creek and Institutional Evil, 1932, identified key factors that enabled the monastery's operations: geographic isolation, religious authority, economic dependence, systematic blackmail, and what she termed communal cognitive dissonance. The community's psychological need to believe in the monastery's benevolence despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The survivors themselves formed an informal network, meeting annually from 1925 to 1943 in Boston. Their gatherings, documented by social worker Helen Crawford, were marked by shared trauma but also remarkable resilience. Robert Morrison, one of the 3 initial survivors to testify, became an advocate for child welfare reform, though he never fully recovered from his experiences. In his final interview in 1954, he said, "People ask me how I survived when so many didn't. The truth is, I didn't survive, not really. The boy who entered Hollow Creek died there. What emerged was something else, someone who could carry the memory of what happened and ensure it was never forgotten." Martha Blackwood dedicated her life to investigating other potential cases of institutional abuse. Her files, donated to Harvard University after her death in 1959, contained evidence of suspicious activities at dozens of institutions, though most of her claims were dismissed as paranoid delusions brought on by trauma. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers began to realize many of her delusions were accurately identifying patterns of abuse that wouldn't be officially recognized for decades. The story of Hollow Creek Monastery forces us to confront a truth that civilized society desperately wishes to avoid: that the greatest evils are not committed by monsters easily identified and cast out, but by those who walk among us clothed in respectability, armed with elaborate justifications, and shielded by our own desperate need to believe in the goodness of our institutions. Father Benedict, Dr. Augustus Blackstone, was not a madman in any conventional sense. His journals, now housed in a restricted section of the Harvard Medical Library, reveal a brilliant mind that had convinced itself that suffering was merely a doorway to transcendence. He wrote in 1897, "History will judge me harshly, for history is written by those who lack the courage to transcend conventional morality. Every great leap forward in human knowledge has required sacrifice. The anatomists who first mapped the human body robbed graves and desecrated corpses. I simply chose living subjects to better understand the intersection of flesh and spirit. The children I transformed did not die. They became part of something eternal, something beyond the comprehension of those trapped in their temporary flesh." This self-aggrandizing philosophy might be dismissed as the ravings of a psychopath, except for one deeply troubling fact: Father Benedict was not alone. The network of correspondence found in the monastery's archives reveals dozens of doctors, scientists, and theologians across the world who shared his beliefs, who saw in his work not atrocity but advancement. Dr. Wilhelm Steinberg wrote from Vienna in 1883, "Your techniques for maintaining consciousness during extreme procedures surpass anything achieved in European medical schools. While they would hang us for such work here, history will recognize you as a pioneer who dared to explore where others feared to tread." The Hollow Creek tragedy reveals how evil institutions operate not through force, but through the manipulation of virtue. Every person who enabled the monastery's crimes believed they were doing good, placing orphans in caring hands, supporting religious charity, providing medical care to the poor. The parents who paid for their disabled children to be treated at Hollow Creek genuinely believed they were accessing revolutionary medical care. The town officials who directed orphans to the monastery thought they were providing those children with opportunities for education and betterment. Even the monks themselves, twisted as their actions were, believed they were conducting holy work. This weaponization of goodness is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Hollow Creek story. It suggests that our very virtues, our trust, our charity, our respect for authority, can be turned against us. The community of Millbridge wasn't uniquely gullible or morally deficient. They were ordinary people who couldn't conceive that someone who spoke so eloquently of God's love could be capable of such systematic evil. The question that haunted Sheriff Hartley until his death, and should haunt us still, is this: how many Hollow Creeks operate today, hidden behind different facades but employing the same fundamental deception? Brother Thomas's letter claiming 43 similar institutions was never verified, but the patterns identified at Hollow Creek, isolation, religious or medical authority, focus on society's most vulnerable, elaborate documentation systems to maintain legitimacy. These patterns appear throughout history and across cultures. Consider the parallels to other historical atrocities that would only come to light decades after Hollow Creek. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where doctors allowed African American men to suffer and die from treatable disease in the name of medical research. The Duplessis orphans in Quebec, where thousands of children were falsely declared mentally ill and subjected to psychiatric experimentation. The Indian residential schools, where cultural genocide was perpetrated under the guise of education and Christian salvation. Each of these horrors operated using the same playbook Father Benedict had perfected: institutional authority, vulnerable populations, elaborate justifications, and communities that chose not to see. The decoded portions of Father Benedict's final experiments, those conducted on himself and his 12 disciples in their synchronized suicide of 1901, suggest something even more disturbing. The positioning of their bodies, the chemicals they ingested, the surgical modifications they had performed on themselves in their final months, all pointed to a genuine belief that they were achieving some form of transcendence. The fact that the candles in the chapel continued burning for 22 years through an ingenious mechanical system suggests they expected someone to find them, to witness what they believed was their transformation. Dr. Carl Jung, who reviewed the case files in 1926 at the request of the Swiss government, which was investigating similar allegations at a sanitarium in Geneva, wrote, "The Hollow Creek case represents the shadow of the Enlightenment itself, the dark twin of our belief in progress through knowledge. These men perverted the scientific method into a tool of unconscionable evil, yet they used the language and logic of science throughout. They kept meticulous records, formed hypotheses, conducted repeatable experiments. That their subjects were unwilling children rather than laboratory animals was, in their twisted logic, simply a necessity for understanding the human condition. The mathematical precision of the horror is worth contemplating. Father Benedict's journals record exactly 341 procedures over 50 years, an average of one every 2 months. Each procedure was documented with the same clinical detachment, noting the subject's age, physical condition, responses to various stimuli, and ultimate disposition. The banality of these records, reading like inventory logs or agricultural reports, demonstrates how evil becomes routine, how atrocity becomes paperwork. But perhaps the most chilling revelation from the investigation was how close the monastery came to never being discovered at all. If not for the unusually warm autumn of 1923 accelerating decomposition, if not for young Daniel Morse's curiosity, if not for Sheriff Hartley's determination to see the investigation through despite pressure to declare it a simple case of mass suicide, the monastery's secrets might have remained buried forever. How many other Hollow Creeks have been more successful in concealing their crimes? The survivor's testimony reveals another crucial truth. Evil of this magnitude leaves wounds that never heal. Every survivor reported lifelong nightmares, inability to trust authority figures, and what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Clara Jennings, who worked with survivors at the Brattleboro retreat, noted that many developed what she called a sixth sense for institutional evil. They could identify other survivors of institutional abuse simply by recognizing a certain hollowness in their eyes, a perpetual watchfulness, an inability to ever fully relax. The transformation of Pembroke County after the revelation, from a thriving rural community to a cautionary tale that lost half its population, demonstrates how the discovery of evil can be almost as destructive as the evil itself. The innocent suffered alongside the complicit. Children who had never set foot in the monastery were stigmatized. Businesses failed not because their owners were involved, but because the entire region had become synonymous with unspeakable horror. Yet there is something valuable in this suffering, this inability to forget. The Hollow Creek Memorial Fund, despite its modest compensation to survivors, funded investigations that exposed abuse at dozens of other institutions. The reforms inspired by the tragedy, however imperfect, saved countless children from similar fates. The story itself, as horrible as it is, serves as a warning, a reminder that evil often comes dressed as good, that the most dangerous predators are those who have convinced themselves they are saviors. In his final journal entry before taking his own life, Sheriff William Hartley wrote, "I have spent 28 years trying to understand how Father Benedict could do what he did, how the community could fail to see it, and how God could allow it to happen. I have no answers, only a terrible certainty that it could happen again. Is happening again somewhere. Will happen again because we forget, because we choose comfort over vigilance, because we would rather believe in the goodness of our neighbors than confront the possibility of their evil. The children of Hollow Creek cry out from their unmarked graves not for justice. It is too late for that, but for remembrance, for us to never again turn away from the signs, never again choose ignorance over investigation, never again allow our virtues to be weaponized against the innocent. The empty field where Hollow Creek Monastery once stood is now overgrown with wild blackberry bushes and young birch trees. Locals still avoid it, claiming they can hear crying in the wind, see lights that shouldn't be there, feel a coldness that has nothing to do with temperature. Whether these are genuine supernatural